Hello, girls, gays, and theys, and the occasional cis-het men who watch me. I love and appreciate you all, and welcome to the Queer Anne podcast. I'm your host, Nastasia, and I use she, her pronouns. And today's topic is going to be something that I think is very important to talk about, something that I think is very relevant. And it's going to be a little bit of a different setup. It's going to be kind of all over the place because I'm going to be talking about the positives, the negatives, what still needs to be done, my experiences with it, etc. So the topic at hand today is queer representation. That means queer representation in literature, in media, in movies, in schools, except like everywhere. Just the broad sense of representation. So yeah. Without further ado, let's just get into the topic because I have a lot to say and I don't want this episode to be too long. So yeah. First, I want to start off with I think that representation in general, especially queer representation, has just started to be something that brands and corporations and media outlets have been trying to incorporate and to improve for the past maybe 6-7 years. And I think that it's very much more a recent wave rather than something that has always been with us, which is good because it's change, and this type of change is good. This type of change is healthy, but I also think that it's bad because there's still so much that needs to be done, and also it's kind of like people like me who have already grown up with shows without representation of differences, without queer representation. Like when I was young, I remember like I was watching shows, and maybe the only show where I remember there being queer representation was Sesame Street with Bert and Ernie, but it wasn't really like, it wasn't something that was like, it didn't click in my head and I wasn't really made aware of it, because obviously gay marriage and LGBTQ plus people were very much still a taboo topic, and I'm not saying that they're not today, but it's like we're kind of breaking barriers. And in 2015 it's where gay marriage got legalized here, but I was already like 10 by that time, so it already grown out of most, like I've already grown and already like had enough experiences, and still even in 2015 there wasn't much representation. So yeah, and I think that that definitely had a toll on me and myself growing up, and a lot of my experiences as growing up queer with internalized homophobia and just feeling like I didn't belong, and I didn't know that there were people who were like me and people who felt like me. And I think that if there was representation when I was younger, it would have been a lot easier for me to accept myself, for me to come out, and for me to feel less alone. But I feel like I had to do a lot of the work myself because of the lack of representation. So I guess that is a way of me trying to highlight how important representation really is and how I think it's necessary to be everywhere. So yeah, and I think that it's currently a controversial topic in politics, especially in America, with Republican politicians talking about, banning critical race theory, banning books that speak about gay people, people of color, slavery, and all these past historic experiences of, being different than what's considered okay and what's considered, like being different than being privileged, like just not being privileged in general. I think that that's something that people are scared of representing. I don't understand why. I think it's dumb, and banning books with any type of representation does a lot more harm than you think, and then I think any politician cares to think about, because they're probably the most privileged people in the world, so it doesn't matter to them. It doesn't change anything for them, but it changes everything for the rest of us, especially people within targeted minority groups. So yeah, I guess I'm going to have to divide this into sections so that I can get my clear thoughts on everything and so that it's just not a mess everywhere. Which, I mean, my episodes are already like that, so I feel like it's not a shocker, but I don't want it to be like that. I want it to be concise and okay because I think this is super important and I want you guys to understand where I'm trying to get at. So, yeah, let's talk about the current political debacle of representation and why I think it's dumb and why I think Republicans are wrong. In a sense, this podcast is very much also a political podcast. I'm a poli-sci major. It's what I do. It's what I love. So just expect a little bit more of political content being thrown in here and there. But yeah, let's just start with that. So Republican candidates, especially, like, I think some of the worst people that come to my mind is like Ron DeSantis right now, who is very prominent in Florida and in more right-wing states. And he's running for president, which is terrifying. But I think he has made it his entire goal and his entire personality to strip away rights from already targeted minority groups. Like, he is stripping away gender-affirming care for trans youth and trans individuals. He's stripping away queer representation, people of color representation, any type of minority representation. He has banned so many books in Florida that are just books that speak about different experiences, like Black experiences, historic events such as slavery, Stonewall. And, he's even banning children's books where there's any slight mention of, a different families, like families that have, Black families, queer families, anything like that. And I think that it comes from ignorance. That's the first thing. And I think that it comes from ignorance and not giving a fuck. You don't care because it doesn't affect you. You don't care because you've always held all the power. And you will probably, for a while at least, still continue to hold all the power. So you don't care. You don't care that it's gonna affect someone's life negatively because that's kind of your goal. You don't want queer people to feel welcomed because you want them to feel silenced. You want them to feel scared. You want them to feel alone so that they don't come out, so that they don't, I don't know how to word this, so that they don't pose a threat to what you are trying to achieve, which is keeping your privileged status and keeping your hierarchy of being the most powerful, which cis-het white men have always been in society. So and I think that it frightens you that there's this push for inclusion because you don't want to lose your power, even though that's not how inclusivity works, but you don't know any better because you are dumb. And I think a lot of it comes from the whole aspect of hating America, because if you learn about slavery, you will hate America, which is the biggest bullshit I've ever fucking heard. It's part of our history. It's important to acknowledge history so that history doesn't repeat itself, but I think that Ron DeSantis doesn't give a fuck if history repeats itself. I think that he could care less about any of that. So yeah, I think that censoring inclusivity and censoring, queer representation and queer outlets, unfortunately, is a great political tactic, because I think that as a politician, if you do not have a lot of experience or you do not have a lot of talking points that people generally agree with, the easiest thing that you can do to gain votes is attack minorities, because there will always be super right-wing people who will just live on that. I think that that's why a lot of politicians right now are politicizing off of queer people, politicizing off of people of color, because they know that it's gonna do great things for their campaign. Unfortunately, obviously, but I think that I see a trend in politics where it's like once a politician is kind of losing their relevance and their power, they just go boom, straight for attacking queer people, black rights, anything like that, because they know that that'll get them a lot of attention, even from left wing politicians, because obviously there's going to be a lot of debate about it. There's going to be a lot of like hesitance around it and a lot of resistance towards it, which one, whether it's negative or positive attention, it's still attention, and it's still somehow brings more awareness to you and your campaign, and it, you know, gives you support. So I think that that's definitely a trend in politics right now, and I definitely think that it's just a whole strategy to get votes and a whole strategy to get seen. But I also do think that these politicians are not bluffing. These politicians are actually, they believe what they say, and they're actually going to do all of those things. But I think that they are so vocal about it because right now it's such a like a popular thing in right-wing media. It's like, how can we stop this from happening? How can we strip rights away and like all that stuff? So I think that that's why politicians such as Ron DeSantis are so popular right now, and so their campaigns are doing so well, because they are, you know, feeding into the power struggle and like people who are the majority wanting to keep their power and just wanting to, you know, be the highest ones in society and like whatever. I don't know. But I also do think that Ron DeSantis is a scary individual who 100% intends to do everything that he says, and he's already done so much harm to the queer community and to people of color. So now that I've gotten through kind of like the basics of like political strategies and like all of that, I think I want to talk about, like, I really want to dig into queer representation specifically. So I'm gonna do that by starting with the positives, what I think is good about it. So yeah, I think that queer representation is good because it's representation, and that sounds probably very stupid, like obviously duh, but I don't know that a lot of people understand how much that means for people like me who are part of a minority group and who are part of, you know, a group that's still very much discriminated against. Because when we see people like us who have similar struggles like us, who act like us, who look like us, whatever the case may be, we feel accepted, we feel normal, and it helps normalize us and our experiences and our existence, which I think is so important, because I think the whole like thing about queerness is that the whole debate that it's unnatural and that it's, you know, that it's not normal. But like I think working against that narrative very much is a helpful thing and very much is a good thing. And I think another thing of representation is that it even helps with bigoted ideologies and with ignorance, because I think personally that ignorance stems from a lot of lack of knowledge. And obviously you're going to have a lack of knowledge if these people have not been represented properly, if these people have not been on media outlets, because where would you get your information from? How would you know about their experiences, about their existence? How would you know what to believe, what narratives to believe, if there isn't some basic representation, if these people aren't being, you know, talked about, and they aren't being, their experiences aren't being shared and their existence aren't being shared, etc., etc. And I've definitely seen a shift in even some people in my family who used to be very closed-minded and bigoted, as queer representation started to like spread more into like every media outlet and kind of became a more like popular thing. They've kind of changed their minds a little bit and they can understand it a little bit more. And obviously it's not as in-depth as it should be, but it's better than nothing. And I think that that's also a whole concept of like exposure therapy, which is something that very much works. I think that like the whole idea of exposure therapy is like, let's say you have a fear, let's say you have social anxiety. So like your entire like what you would work on in exposure therapy is the idea of like being exposed to your fears. So like if it's social anxiety, your work would mainly be to socialize, to get out there and to, you know, show yourself and in little bits and bits and bits and bits. And I think that exposure therapy works exactly the way that it should in queer representation, because you're being exposed here and there to queer people, to queer experiences, and it helps you understand it a little bit more, and it helps you normalize it in your head a little bit more. And I genuinely think that it works. And it also, another aspect of queer representation is like for queer people itself. It's for us. It makes us feel seen and welcomed, loved, accepted, and it lowers rates of suicidal ideology, anxiety, depression, any other mental health issues amongst LGBTQ plus youth, because now that we're being represented, we feel less alone, and we feel less like we're not normal or there's something wrong with us, which all lowers mental health issues, because mental health plays into like all of this. So I think that that's super important, and I think that that's super relevant to talk about, because it's something that it's life changing for me, honestly. Ever since I really started there, ever since like I guess shows started having queer representation, I've just been so much happier, and that's all I watch right now. Like, I'm not even joking. I literally specifically only watch queer shows right now, or like shows where there's enough queer representation for me to feel comfortable, because if there's a show that doesn't even brush on it or brush on the queer experiences, I can watch it, but it feels it there's a part of me that isn't truly connecting with the characters and with the storyline, because I don't feel represented in any way, shape, or form. So that's why for me it's super important to watch shows that are include queer characters, include queer representation. They don't have to be explicitly just about queerness. They can be just regular shows that touch on the topic even a little bit, or have like queer like characters, and like it's a very normal thing that's just kind of in shows, kind of like with life. It's like we kind of just exist. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. We're a part of humanity, we're a part of life, and I think that it's important to start including us into narratives like that, because that's where we always were. Like, we're here, we're queer, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that's something that is important to be publicized. Yeah. So now I'm going to talk about some shows that I think are really good in terms of representation, and touching on certain topics that should be talked about and should be recognized. Brooklyn Nine-Nine, one of my favorite shows, even though the show itself isn't really about queerness. There's queer characters, and there's queer representation, and there's also people of color representation, and it's a show that I can connect with. There are characters that I can connect with, issues, experiences that I can connect with, and it feels true. It feels real. Another show is Euphoria. Obviously, another show that really isn't, the entire storyline isn't about queerness, but there's queer characters, there's queer experiences that I can relate to. And then another show, like Heartstopper and Young Royals, are specifically queer shows. Like, they're meant for all kinds of queer representation. It's just an entire like queer show about queer love and stuff, which is amazing, and I think it's brilliant. But like, it doesn't have to just be that narrative. It can also just be shows that just have queer people in them, just like how like in your life it may not be your entire goal, and it may not be everything that you talk about, but there's queer people in your life probably, like, and it's just like normal to have them there. So like, yeah, it doesn't have to be the entire storyline, but it's still important. But it also can't be in the entire storyline because it makes us feel represented in one way or another. And can we have it, please? Like, let us have something, because there are so many rom-com movies and romance movies and shows that are specifically about heteronormativity, and that's that's been my reality. That's what I grew up watching. All of these stories about princesses falling in love with princes, and then when that wasn't the case for me, I felt very much like there was something wrong with me, and like I just wasn't, I didn't feel like I belonged, which played a lot of roles in me feeling guilt and shame around my sexuality. So yeah, I guess I'm just trying to like prove a point that it doesn't have to be only queer representation that's talked about throughout shows, but it's important that it's there nonetheless. Like, just have representation. So yeah, positive aspects of representation. Now let's talk negative aspects of representation. Negative aspects of representation is misrepresentation. So like, just if it's like a mockery, but like I guess it wasn't made to be a mockery, but it is very much is a mockery. And I think that I don't want to say that this is a bad representation, because I don't think that it's a bad representation, because I think that it's true for some people in the community. But like, when there's usually a gay male character in a show that's not about queerness, they're very feminine, and they're very, out there, and they talk differently, and they look very different. And it's kind of like there's a stereotypical way that a gay male looks like, and I think that that's very harmful, because it puts us in boxes, it puts us in stereotypes, and it limits us, because if you don't look that way, if you don't act that way, then it's like, oh, are you really gay? And I think that even for me, as a very femme presenting person, and if I didn't have this podcast, if I didn't talk about these issues as much as I do, if you just saw me on the street, you probably wouldn't think that I was gay. You probably wouldn't, that wouldn't cross your mind. And that's fine, that's okay. But it puts me in a box, it stereotypes me, because sometimes I feel like I have to work a lot harder to prove myself, that that I'm gay and whatever. And especially now that I don't have bright colored hair, I think when I had bright colored hair, it helped me, because it like obviously was played into the stereotype. But now I feel like there's a lot more, like, I don't know, when I go out sometimes I don't get as much attention from girls as I do from guys, and that's fine, because I can be bi, or like I could, all of that, you know. But I think that those stereotypes are harmful, because then people think that that's the only way a queer person can look like, and that's the only way a queer person can act, when that's not true at all. There's a lot of different queer experiences and a lot of different queer people, and I think that that's more of a harmful narrative for queer men, because they're expected to act like that, they're expected to dress like that, to look like that, to be into makeup, to be into femme clothes and all that. And when they're not, it's kind of like, ooh, like, what, you're gay? And you look like that? Like, what? I would have never guessed that you look so straight. And it's like, that's so harmful. That is so harmful. Like, what are we doing as a society? Like, we've progressed so much, but we're also holding on to those stereotypes so much, which is so harmful. But like, I think Kit Connor, who it plays Nick Nelson in Heartstopper, even in the show and in real life, his queerness has been questioned, because he doesn't look typically queer. He doesn't act queer, with like quote on, like with air quotes, because like, what is that supposed to mean, So yes, that's a harmful narrative, I think, definitely. And I think another harmful thing is there's still so much lack of representation for certain groups and certain people within the LGBTQ plus community. For example, myself, I feel like I'm okay. I think that there's like I would rate lesbian representation on a scale from 1 to 10, maybe a 4, which is pretty disappointing. But I think that a lot of shows that are specifically focused on lesbians have been canceled after one season, or it's usually like even in Heartstopper, there are lesbian characters, but it's not, the focus isn't around them, which is fine. There can be gay shows and the focus doesn't have to be on people like me, but there should also be shows where the focus is on people like me, because I would love that. I'm dying for there to be a lesbian show that's as good as Heartstopper or Young Royals or Red, White, and Royal Blue. Like, oh my god, I need it. I'm living for it. I just want it so bad. I want a show that's focused on lesbian love and that isn't canceled after the first season, Netflix. Like, it angers me so much because it means everything to me to be able to be properly represented. And I feel like I'm not even close to being properly represented or represented enough in media outlets. But I think I'm still represented more than asexual people, aromantic people, trans people, specifically trans mask people, because I've noticed in a lot of movies and in a lot of shows that I watch, if they do have trans representation, it's usually trans femme representation, which is great, amazing, but there should also be trans mask representation. Hello. And non-binary representation and representation like that, I think it's important. And I think that more should be done to include all different types of queer people across the spectrum. Yes, preach. And I know that, like, I've even gotten some insight from my friends for this, specifically because sometimes when I look at trans representation, having a trans character in a show, I'm like, oh, this is so good, this is great representation. But sometimes my trans friends will be like, it's great representation, but it's trans femme representation. There's not. Sorry, I had to sneeze. Oh my god. Okay, yeah, it's like trans femme representation, but they want trans mask representation, and I really haven't. Now that I think about it, I haven't watched a show or a movie that I know of that had trans mask representation, which is really disappointing, because it's 2023. There should be more active work being done to represent everyone. Asexual people, I think, are being represented here and there in shows, but I think that there's so much more that needs to be done. So those are the negative aspects of representation: misrepresentation, not enough representation, stereotypes, and stuff like that. So what needs to be done? A lot. I think what needs to be done is, giving queer roles to queer people, which I think has been starting to be done, but I think that it's the best way to get proper representation, because those people have their own personal experiences that they can relate to and base characters off of, or just play out. And I think that that's super important, especially when we're talking about people in the queer community who aren't as represented as much, like trans people. Making sure that there's an effort to include their voices in shows, so that the representation is actually meaningful and actually contributes to greater good and contributes to people feeling accepted. And where I see a lot of people talk about their own experiences, so it's TikTok, YouTube, and in podcasts, which is great, but it's also work being done by queer people. I'm sitting here talking about my experiences, trying to spread more representation, trying to spread more knowledge and educate people, which is great. It needs to be done, but it's also exhausting that I have to do it, because there's not enough of it out there already being done by bigger corporations, people who have more of a media outreach. I have to start from nowhere and build up this hopefully audience, and hopefully people who will listen to me and people who will educate themselves and stuff like that. where it's like Netflix, Disney, Nickelodeon, and all of these big brands should be the ones doing this because they already have the outreach, they already have the audience. So yeah, I think that that's what needs to be done, and I think the ways that we can do it is including queer people into this, like making sure that their voices are heard and properly represented. Yeah, I think more focus needs to be put on that rather than just like straight people, making queer characters that still some way or another hold on to heteronormativity or hold on to stereotypes that are harmful for the community. Another thing that I wanted to branch off of is like video games. Like for me, I'm not a huge gamer. I'm not really into video games, but there are a few video games that I've played, like Sims, which I guess it's not really a video game, but like it kind of is, okay? And in Sims, I have a lesbian family. I have a wife and 2 kids, and it's like I live for it. I live for it because it's not something that I got to do when I was little. When I was little and I was playing video games, I didn't really know that wasn't an option. That couldn't have been done. And that also contributed to how I feel. And like in Episode, which I know it's not a video game, but I was so obsessed with Episode as a preteen that it was actually so terrible. But I remember that like just now in the recent years they've added like an option that you can choose who you would want to date in those stories, and ever since they had the option for girls, I've lived for it, because having a boyfriend in a video game is whatever, but it never truly satisfied me as much as having a girlfriend in the video game does. Like, oh my god, I love it. So yeah, that's another aspect. And kind of just to wrap things up, queer representation makes me so happy. It makes me feel seen and heard, and I live for it. Queer stories and queer experiences and queer romance makes me so giddy. I'm like, oh, even if it's not about me, even if it's like gay representation rather than like women-loving women representation, I'm still like, ugh, I live for it because that's my community. Those are my people. I love them. So yeah, I think that's why it's important. I think that there should be an international reach for this kind of representation. I want to see it in Serbian shows, okay? And I know damn well that it's not in any Serbian show, even in 2023, and that there has been so much like controversy over adding like queer people into shows, queer people into history, into school curriculum, where like in psychology you acknowledge internalized homophobia, you acknowledge the struggles that queer people have that maybe straight people don't, and you're kind of letting go a little teeny bit of heteronormativity, whereas in other countries they're like, nope, grasping onto it for dear life when we need this heteronormativity, and that's disappointing. But I hope it improves. I have even now in Serbia there's a little bit more queer representation, but they have every now and then they have a gay guest on a show, talks about their experiences. It's usually a debate with a right-wing person, which pisses me off because we shouldn't always have to debate our existence. We shouldn't always have to prove ourselves. But still there are certain magazines that have queer representation, but it's also by queer people, so they're also doing their own labor into making their voices heard. But one way or another, we're getting heard. We exist, okay, and we're everywhere, and we should be included everywhere. We're in the most rural areas, we're in the most populated areas, we're in LA, we're in New York, we're also in Serbia, we're also in Russia, we're also in Zimbabwe. We are human beings. We exist outside of your stereotypes, outside of your boxes. We have different experiences, we have different opinions, different political stances, because we are not all the same. And that is okay. And that is something that should be understood about queer people. Okay? We do not all think the same, we do not all dress the same, we do not all act the same, we do not all talk the same, etc., etc., etc. That is a-okay. But nevertheless, we are a community and we love each other and we support each other. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you got something out of it, and Netflix, Disney, Nickelodeon, hit me up if you need queer representation, just saying. But yeah, I'm super glad that you sticked to the end if you did, and if you didn't, no hard feelings. Podcasts aren't for everyone. But yeah, thank you for listening. I will see you next Friday. I'm so excited. I don't know what my topic will be, but we will get there. We will get there. Make sure to follow me on Instagram and keep up with me. You can vote on some polls that I have on my Instagram, Queer and Podcast. That's my I share a lot of queer experiences, and I share a lot of queer activists and queer influencers. So if you don't follow me there already, make sure you do. I love you all. I hope you have a beautiful day. And I hope it's filled with rainbows and sunshine. And yeah, bye.